The gruesome case of Kate Webster. On a quiet March day in 1879, a shocking murder unfolded that would grip the Victorian-era public with its gruesome details and chilling aftermath. Kate Webster, a domestic servant with a troubled history, brutally murdered her employer, Julia Martha Thomas, in a crime that would not only lead to her execution, but continue to haunt the world over a century later. A troubled past. Kate Webster, born in Ireland in the early 1850s, had a long history of petty crime. She was known for her knack for deception, often using fake names and fabricated tales of misfortune to manipulate those around her. By her teenage years, she was already familiar with prison life, having been jailed multiple times for theft and fraud. Despite her criminal background, Webster managed to secure work as a domestic servant, though her employment rarely lasted long due to her poor work ethic and tendency to lie. When Julia Martha Thomas, a 55-year-old widowed woman living in Richmond, London, hired Webster in January 1879, she hoped for a reliable housemaid. However, Mrs. Thomas quickly grew dissatisfied with Webster's performance, describing her as clumsy, incompetent, and difficult to manage. By February, she decided to dismiss Webster, but the servant pleaded for an extension, requesting to stay until March 2nd, 1879. Mrs. Thomas agreed, unaware of the horror that would soon follow. Murder on the staircase. The final day of Webster's employment began like any other. However, tensions between the two women had reached a boiling point. That evening, during a heated argument, Webster violently pushed Mrs. Thomas down a flight of stairs. The fall rendered Mrs. Thomas unconscious, but Webster did not stop there. In a fit of rage, she strangled her employer until she was certain she was dead. The aftermath of the murder was even more chilling. To conceal her crime, Webster dismembered Mrs. Thomas's body. She boiled some of the remains, likely in an attempt to make disposal easier, and packed the dismembered body parts into a large box. These parts were later thrown into the River Thames. One particularly macabre detail emerged during the investigation. Webster reportedly served 2 neighborhood boys a meal of what she claimed was pig fat, but was later revealed to be lard from Mrs. Thomas's remains. Living the lie. In the weeks following the murder, Webster assumed the identity of her victim. She wore Mrs. Thomas's clothing, took possession of her belongings, and even introduced herself to neighbors as the widow Julia Martha Thomas. She went so far as to sell her employer's furniture and valuables to make quick cash. For a time, her deception worked. However, 2 men who were familiar with the real Mrs. Thomas grew suspicious. They reported their concerns to the police, leading to an investigation that uncovered the horrifying truth. Escape and capture. By the time the authorities began closing in, Webster had fled to Ireland, hoping to escape justice. However, her attempt at evasion was short-lived. She was arrested in her hometown and extradited back to England to stand trial. The trial of Kate Webster became a media sensation, with the public eagerly following the grisly details. Despite her defense team's efforts to paint her as mentally unstable, the evidence against her was overwhelming. The jury found her guilty of murder, and she was sentenced to death. On July 29, 1879, Kate Webster was hanged at Wandsworth Prison, becoming only the 2nd person executed there. A discovery. Over a century later. For most, the story of Kate Webster and Julia Martha Thomas ended with Webster's execution. But in 2009, a startling discovery brought the case back into the spotlight. Sir David Attenborough, the renowned broadcaster and presenter of Planet Earth, purchased a property behind his Richmond home, intending to extend his garden. During excavation work, workers uncovered a human skull buried on the land. Historians quickly connected the find to the infamous murder. In the late 19th century, the property had been a derelict pub. It is believed that Webster, in her frantic attempts to hide the evidence, buried Mrs. Thomas's head behind the pub. A coroner later confirmed that the skull belonged to Julia Martha Thomas, finally completing the puzzle of her tragic demise. Legacy of the crime. The murder of Julia Martha Thomas remains one of Victorian England's most infamous cases, remembered not only for its gruesome nature, but also for the extraordinary twists that followed. The rediscovery of Mrs. Thomas's skull over 130 years later serves as a haunting reminder of a crime that shocked a nation and continues to fascinate true crime enthusiasts to this day.